Hi, this is Mark Linsenmayer talking to Frithjof Bergmann and Blair Anderson. Tell us who you are.
Hello, my name is Blair Anderson. I'm a community activist, a former Black Panther, member of several civil rights organizations and Black nationalist organizations in the early part of my life.
And we were going to talk about what's going on with new work in Detroit, right? Is that what?
Yes.
Or how your work is overlapping with Frithjof's. So go ahead, start us off. What's going on in Detroit?
I originally worked in Detroit a long time ago. In fact, in the 80s, 85, 86, 87. But I left and worked in Africa and India and Russia and other places. And I've now come back to Detroit. And so while I have come back to Detroit, I, of course, met new people in that. And one of the most important new people I have met is sitting to my right, and he is Blair Anderson. And at this time, we are both working in a kind of brotherly partnership on introducing new work into parts of Detroit. And the part of new work that, if you are in Detroit, is inescapably obvious, is the inequality that our system has made worse and worse in the last years, to the point now where whole parts of Detroit are in ruins. Really, one can drive through many streets, but I think most people at this point know this, that one can drive through streets where there's hardly a house that has not been burned down. Most houses are burned down, and people do still live in these houses, but very often in the basement of these houses. But only a few blocks from those houses are areas of Detroit that are sumptuous and that are opulent and that have splendid houses that are still in splendid shape. Now, we work especially on, of course, the poverty-ridden parts of Detroit. And to my mind, it is important to have a clear picture of what created this inequality. And I think the quickest summary that we have been able to condense is that it has to do with automation. And in Detroit, again, that is inescapably obvious because you cannot drive around Detroit long without running into one automobile plant after the other. Automobile plant that has been closed, where now there are empty shells of what were formerly renowned automobile factories, assembly plants, and then now ruins. And that had a lot to do with automation, and automation making it possible for people to work in other countries, in other areas, very often with the idea that wages there were cheaper. So automation is one huge factor. Globalization is a second huge factor. Globalization means that in the past in which Detroit was a glory of a city, Detroit had many things that made Detroit eminent among cities, that made it a kind of prince or king among cities. A statistic that is very often quoted is that home ownership, that is the number of people who own the houses in which they live, was higher in Detroit than anywhere else. So these are all houses, splendid houses, and the people who lived in it owned the houses, and they worked in automobile plants at very high salaries, $16, $18, $22 an hour. The third factor, besides automation and globalization, that I very much like to emphasize, is that farming has played a great role in the creation of inequality that is people used to farm in a way that now has literally ceased to exist. That is, 70% of all people were actually living on farms and working on farms, and that was their work. They worked on farms and lived on farms, but that was their job, as it were, although, of course, it wasn't like a job. It was importantly different, but they had work on their farms. And this, roughly speaking, has collapsed to the point where now 4% of the population are living on farms. So I want to emphasize this once more, because constantly, whether one listens to Obama or whether one listens to Summer or whoever one listens to, one always hears the reiteration that we are in a slow recovery, that the recovery is oddly sort of somnambulance. That is utterly wrong. I mean, the three factors I just mentioned have produced the situation we have, the incredible inequality, and that incredible equality is not going to go away for any of the mild measures that people suggest, like stimulating the economy or putting more money into the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our conviction is that if one wants to do something against that, what one has to do is introduce new work. That's what we're trying to do in Detroit. And between the two of us, I will now stop talking in a minute, because my part of this is to set the stage. My part of this has worked out the ideas, the direction, the general orientation, the of questions that are involved in new work. Anderson sitting next to me is much more a person who actually works on this in a very hands-on, very everyday fashion. And I think that's what he will be talking about. So now, Blair Anderson.
Okay. Thank you both for the introduction. At the beginning of Frithjof's presentation, he said a kind of brotherhood. I want to say a new kind of brotherhood. Here I am, a noted Black nationalist, a former revolutionary Black Panther, gang leader, gang member, a man who has spent some 30 plus years of his life in prison. And so for me to be sitting here with a professor of several different schools to talk about revolution in a whole different way. Something that Grace Lee Boggs said, the evolution of revolution. Frithjof talks about new work as a way, as a revolutionary movement, the change in America. We don't have a choice. The jobs are gone. In this community, there is where households had one or two or three or four people working. Now there's one person supporting a household. How do we make that viable? How do we make it sustainable? That's what new work addresses. That's what has attracted me to it. It gets us away from all the theory, the difference between Republicans and Democrats, communists and capitalists. It gets us to things that work in the communities of America and the world.
Could you describe one or two of those as specifically as possible? What actually in Detroit, in your experience, what are you doing and what is working?
Okay. 20 months ago, I came home from prison. Basically unemployable, 62 years old, not the strongest back anymore. And in new work, what I found was a way to use the skills that I have to create several streams of revenue legally. I did leathercraft in prison. And what new work did is it connected me to other leathercrafters in Africa. And so we're talking about producing stuff, producing products in Detroit that we can send to Africa, them producing stuff in Africa that they can send to Detroit. This has helped me to create jobs for myself and for others in the community that we're organizing in. It has helped us to have a different kind of hope, a hope that's based in action.
We had discussed for a moment leather crafts, that the fact that leather crafts are something that you are working on, etc., etc., etc. I was leading to the second thing, and the second thing is that we are also working on improving people's housing. And I think there is a great deal to be said about that, because to some extent people also resist that, and to some extent people feel interfered with, but maybe give us some of the background to what's involved in trying to improve people's housing, which very often means making them weather tighter than they are.
Yeah.
And what you actually can do.
When we talk about new work in this community, we talk about helping people to do the things that they need to do to get by from day to day. And one of those things is weatherizing housing, reducing bills. At the same time, we have a lot of paranoia. People are in a war zone. This is where another component of new work comes in, because we're talking about a new culture, because we have to open up our doors in order to get the help that we need, the training that we need in order to do such things as remodel a home. What's happening in Detroit is that people are living in big homes in the neighborhood where we're organizing. That's on Field Street on the east side in Island View of Detroit. People are living in huge homes that formerly housed their grandparents, their parents, their brothers and their sisters, and maybe even other branches of the family. Now they do not have the revenue in order to maintain that home, because where there might have been 3 or 4 people with jobs, now there's just one. So New Work's solution to that is that we begin to develop enterprises that train people in this community to repair their homes. This can be done economically. It provides jobs. It helps increase the value of the property. It helps create security for people when their homes are secure. At the same time, it prevents the one thing that this community is the most afraid of, and that's strangers coming into their homes, coming into their community. So if we're training up young men and women to repair homes, to repair their homes, their ancestral homes. Some of these homes have been owned in this neighborhood for 60 years. Some of the first African Americans to buy homes, nice homes in Detroit, 5, 6, 7, 8 bedrooms. In fact, there's one house down there that has 17 rooms. And so New Work, what we're doing is we're saying that there are people all over the world who are in the same plight with you, in the same situation. How do we unite and find ways to do what really needs to be done in a community to make it solid and safer?
Can I pick up on the word safer?
Yes.
I'm sure our listeners know something about the degree to which violence is rampant in Detroit. Give us some stories about what that looks like on an everyday level, and how New Work copes with it or deals with it. What about the topic of violence?
I come from a very violent background. And I think that it's a background that is common in the African-American community. I come from civil rights movements and the violence of racism, which led me to seek some type of power that took the form of the early Black nationalist groups and became a way for me to protect myself. Later, we became gangs. I left the street gangs, went to the Black Panthers. So violence was very much a part of my life. It's very much a part of Detroit life. People in poverty often prey upon each other because that's who they have access to. How do we end that? And let me say that the violence is usually economic. This is not just predatory, sadomasochistic violence. This is because men and women don't have jobs, or because the only role model for employment is drugs, or the primary. See, I got to get this right, man.
I think you're doing fine.
I think I'm doing fine.
Yeah. Mark, don't you think he is as good as Lionel Barrymore?
Oh, you've got to edit at that, right? Okay. The primary cause of the violence in the Black community is poverty and hopelessness and access. So if we can end poverty through new work, community production, help people to understand that the skills that they have can create streams of revenue for them. It might be cooking, sewing, combing Frithjof's beard, a barber shop, beauty salon. We need to encourage this.
You have to edit this out.
We have to edit that out. But so what we're doing to address violence is to talk to drug dealers, to talk to people who are selling, let us say, marijuana, which is, marginally legal in the state of Michigan now, and helping them to understand that they can become legal, legitimate, self-sustainable, and independent, or they should become as much as possible. How do we do this? By finding training, creating opportunities for them to start businesses, repairing the homes, cutting the lawns, providing security in the neighborhood, organizing block clubs, creating a new culture that includes people and that strengthens community through interdependence.
All of that is fascinating, but turn it a little bit, turn your attention towards young people. What can be said about young people in Detroit, and in what ways does new work address young people?
I think the first thing, and something that you and I have talked about, is that the young people of this age are the brightest youth of any generation of humanity. That's just across the board. We got to have faith in our young people. When they understand that we believe in them, then they will achieve amazing things. How do we address these issues to them? We create opportunities for them, and we help them to understand that in this day and age, in this economy, that we hope that we want to lead them to higher education, but we would also like to help provide them with craft skills, with construction skills, with trade skills, which will help to bridge them to independence in terms of income. The factory jobs no longer exist. Youth know this. They have generation after generation of unemployment. Fathers and uncles who they've never seen in long-term employment. So they have adopted lifestyles to adjust to this reality in their life. New work addresses this reality, because what new work is about is the reality, is the basic reality of your existence. And how do we go from there, from where you are, to a place where you become self-sufficient, sustainable, independent, not leaning on industry or government for aid and assistance that is basic and your right. You can grow food, you can make clothing, you can start enterprises, you can help your neighbors who have a little extra income to be safer, because you can provide the security in the neighborhood. We recently started a neighborhood watch, and so now we're seeking ways to generate revenue so that the men and women in the neighborhood can protect the neighborhood, can watch out for each other. Where people coming into the neighborhood in the middle of the night can call and say, "I'm driving up, will you come by?"
When we first got to know each other, something that moved me a lot was that you said things like that new work really helped you to understand what was going on. And it was very different from any number of other efforts to ameliorate the situation in Detroit. It actually was very real and substantial, and it gave you a sense that you could do things. Can we try to talk about that, and let me maybe now bring in a little more of the general, the set of general ideas that are the skeleton, or that are the substance of new work. That is something that we constantly talk about, is that the epoch of jobs is over. That the period of jobs lasted 200 years, but it is now in its sunsetting phase, and that people need to face up to the fact that the jobs will not come back, and that unemployment in Detroit is 70, 80, even more percent. So there is the flabbergasted, the absolutely dumbfounded question, so what do we do without jobs? And new work comes on strong and says, no, there are answers to that. What do these answers look like to you, for example? How do you see new work as an answer to the disappearance of jobs?
In our conversations and in the readings that we've done, and in some of the groups that we've had meetings with where we discussed new work, we always emphasize that, and you always emphasize, that there are three components. New economy, that we need to think about money differently. We need to think about the economy differently. New work, we need to think about work differently. People need work, but maybe not as much work. If you're thinking about money differently, how you spend it, how much you need, then maybe you're thinking about work differently. If we think about the combination of those two, compel the third concept, and that is new culture.
Can I be a little difficult?
Yes.
You said very quickly, new economy. And to some people, yeah, that's startling. And yes, of course, we want the new economy. But what are you talking about? So let's slow down between the two of us and say, okay, what, for example, is community production? What do we mean by that? What does this look like? What are examples of that? And in what ways is community production a move towards a new economy, different from the economy of the past?
Yeah, you know, I've had that conversation with you several times. In fact, I've been kind of hard because I've said, how does this make sense? When we think of economy,
this is a moment to be hard, so go ahead.
Yeah, this is an economy. When we think of economy, we think of economy, the entire country. When people in communities think of economy, they think about what impacts their daily lives. And so, though the bigger question is important, what's critical is how new work impacts Field Street, impacts my family. The fact that I have established a new work committee, helped to develop a new work committee that works with me to help me sell leather, impacts my family in that it provides me an opportunity to bring home some money to help pay some bills. At the same time, our conversations, our study, and the progress of my life has led me to understand that I don't need all of the stuff that the marketing companies, that the corporations have said I need. That I need decent clothing, but not necessarily the fanciest, though I got a couple of pretty sharp pieces that I like to dress. I don't have to eat steaks every day, which cost more than string beans and are less healthy, resulting in me having a new culture. I'm healthier. I'm 62 years old, still standing up straight. I'm not sure if I can win a boxing match with him, but he said, he's challenging me. Did I answer your question? Did I respond to it?
Yeah, but I think it would be useful to give a few more examples.
New economy.
Of what? How is this new economy really a new economy?
The first point that I think comes from our studies is that the old economy is evolving. Capitalism is changing. Capital, the way that people have made a living, is changing. Mm-hmm. We don't have a choice in the fact that it's changing. As technology becomes more advanced, less jobs are available.